East versus West, democracy versus communism, the USA versus the Soviet Union. Unfortunately for the people of Vietnam, they became the victims of a struggle far beyond their control, as two superpowers vied for global dominance, using their nation as just one of many proxy battlegrounds. But how much do you truly know about the Vietnam War? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today, we're diving into incredible facts about the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War in the region. The Vietnam War was referred to as the Second Indochina War, being just one conflict in a long series of battles between Indochinese communists and forces from the US, France, China, and others. The North Vietnamese army received financial aid and military supplies from the Soviet Union, China, and other communist allies, whereas the South Vietnamese army was supported by the United States, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, Thailand, and other anti-communist allies. Lasting for nearly 2 decades, the war also triggered the Laotian Civil War and the Cambodian Civil War. Despite US intervention, all three nations would ultimately fall to communism by the mid-1970s. The guerrilla fighters commonly referred to as the Viet Cong in English-language sources were officially known as the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam. US involvement in Vietnam initially began with support for a French effort to reclaim its former colony after Vietnam declared independence shortly following World War II. During World War II, when the Japanese invaded, the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, fought back against the occupiers, receiving aid from the US, the Soviet Union, and China. After Japan's surrender, Ho Chi Minh launched an insurgency against French rule. At the start of 1950, both China and the Soviet Union formally recognized the Viet Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam, based in Hanoi, as Vietnam's legitimate government. Meanwhile, the United States and Great Britain acknowledged the French-backed state of Vietnam, headquartered in Saigon. With that, the groundwork for war between North and South was laid. Viewing the conflict as Soviet-led communist expansion, the United States feared a domino effect following the Korean War, believing it would lead to communist takeovers worldwide. The French war effort in Vietnam fared poorly, and by the mid-1950s, the United States had spent a staggering amount to support the French, covering the vast majority of the war's cost. Facing repeated defeats, the French even requested that the US deploy tactical nuclear weapons against North Vietnamese forces. However, there's no indication the US seriously considered this proposal. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was hesitant to commit to another land war in Asia and made any American involvement contingent on British support, but Britain remained opposed. Following a crushing defeat at Dien Bien Phu, the French were forced to negotiate a ceasefire agreement with the Viet Minh, which granted independence to Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. At the 1954 Geneva Peace Conference, Vietnam was temporarily divided at the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh initially wanted to press forward militarily and take the South, but China persuaded him to achieve his goal through electoral means instead. South Vietnam. During this temporary peace, a mass migration took place, with around 1 million Northerners, mostly Catholic minorities, fleeing south. To encourage this movement, the CIA launched a psychological warfare campaign, exaggerating anti-Catholic sentiment among the Viet Minh and even spreading false rumors that the US planned to drop atomic bombs on Hanoi. The US also funded a major relocation program to transport refugees to the South, resulting in a South Vietnam heavily populated with anti-communist Vietnamese. While a massive number fled the communist North, only a small fraction of that number made the reverse journey, moving from the South to the North. Before long, an insurgency broke out in the South, threatening to tear the country apart. In response, President John F. Kennedy's advisors recommended sending U.S. Special Forces into South Vietnam disguised as flood relief workers. The South Vietnamese military was largely ineffective due to widespread corruption, low morale, and poor training. This was demonstrated at the Battle of Ap Bac, where a much smaller Viet Cong force managed to defeat a significantly larger group of South Vietnamese troops. Believing the South Vietnamese regime under Ngo Dinh Diem was worsening the civil conflict by repressing Buddhist minorities, the US backed a coup attempt led by senior South Vietnamese military officials. Though successful, the coup threw South Vietnam into further disarray, with one military government after another rising and falling. In early August of 1964, the American destroyer USS Maddox was on an intelligence mission in the Gulf of Tonkin when its captain claimed several torpedo boats were stalking it, prompting the ship to open fire. Just 2 days later, reports surfaced of a second attack against the USS Maddox and another American destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, in the same area. The alleged second attack led Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, effectively marking the beginning of the US war against North Vietnam. However, decades later, a declassified NSA report revealed that no second attack had occurred. It is now believed the event was fabricated to justify war against North Vietnam, which was actively arming and training guerrilla fighters in the South. From the mid-1960s to late 1968, Operation Rolling Thunder dropped an immense quantity of missiles, rockets, and bombs on North Vietnam in an attempt to force the North to stop aiding guerrillas in the South. However, Ho Chi Minh, seeing an opportunity to unify the country under his rule, refused to yield. To evade US bombing campaigns, North Vietnamese forces used the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran through Laos. This, in turn, led to a civil war in Laos, with the US-backed Laotian government battling the communist Pathet Lao guerrillas and their North Vietnamese allies. In an effort to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail and prevent the collapse of the Laotian government, the US dropped an enormous amount of bombs on Laos, nearly equaling the total tonnage dropped by the US during all of World War II. The American Ground War. In proportion to its population, Laos is the most heavily bombed country in history. During the early years of the war, the Viet Cong's numbers surged dramatically, while the North Vietnamese army also expanded. In contrast, US forces in Vietnam grew at a much slower rate. The American Ground War formally began in early 1965 with the deployment of US Marines to South Vietnam, a number that would quickly escalate by the year's end. Initially, US troops were assigned a defensive role, but with American military training heavily geared toward offensive operations, many observers believed US commanders were mentally and institutionally unprepared for a defensive mission. That same year, US General William Westmoreland proposed shifting from defensive operations to a full-scale offensive against the Viet Cong and their North Vietnamese supporters. Predicting victory within 2 years, he gained approval from President Johnson. The US sought international support, enlisting military aid from allies in Southeast Asia, including Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and the Philippines. However, most NATO nations declined to participate. The Vietnam War was one of the most controversial and devastating conflicts in modern history, leaving a lasting impact on both the region and the world. Conscription, unclear objectives, and strong domestic opposition to the war left the US military in a weakened state for years after. Despite the fears of a global communist takeover, the so-called domino effect never fully materialized. In the end, the war remains a widely debated and often remembered as a costly, tragic endeavor. What are your thoughts on the Vietnam War? Do you think the US should have intervened in the South Civil War? Be sure to check out our other video on Cold War facts you didn't know. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.